Hello and welcome. My name is Tonya Sutherland-Stewart, and I'm a part of the Jackson Park Project, which is a multi-platform nonprofit organization that teaches people about Emancipation Day celebrations in Windsor, Ontario. Emancipation Day has been celebrated since slavery was abolished across the British Empire in 1834, but the celebrations in Windsor from particularly the 1930s to the 1960s were of a scale and height that led to them being dubbed the greatest freedom show on earth, so a very special part of Canadian history. For my partnership with Culture Days during the Creatives in Residence program, I decided to explore something that came up again and again as I learned about the history of Emancipation Day, as it was something that everyone who attended the celebrations seemed to remember and bring up, and that was the food. So from the vast barbecue pits that lay in Jackson Park to the confectionery things you could get at concessions and other carnival food was a really integral part of the celebrations and in making celebrations what they were. I had the good fortune to interview Elise Harding-Davis, who grew up in the Windsor area and whose family was very involved in the organization and the execution of the yearly Emancipation Day celebrations. Elise and I spoke at length about her memories of the food and what it meant to her and her community, and she is a fantastic storyteller, interviewee, and just someone who's great to listen to. So we had a really good conversation, sharing some of those memories. I hope you enjoy listening. Thank you so much, Elise, for joining me so we can talk about Emancipation Day in particular.
Oh, my pleasure to help out.
Before we jump to the yummy things, though, I'm just going to start with a bit of background information, some context to get to know you a bit better. So to just start off, can I ask, when and where were you born and what area did you grow up in?
I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
That's the area that you kind of grew up in and stayed in for the most part?
Yes. There's an area that is locally called McDougall Street Corridor. When I was born, we lived on Mercer Street, which is one block east, and then just before I turned one, we moved one block west onto Windsor Avenue. Lived there until I was 12 years old, and then my father built my mother a home out in what was called Sandwich West in 1958. It's a part of Windsor now, but all of that included was Windsor, Ontario.
Great. And yeah, I've recently just heard just a little bit about the McDougall corridor and kind of that there's a bit of, Black Canadian history there. So that's something for myself that I'd like to learn more about in general. And just in speaking generally, as you were growing up, was food a big part of your family's traditions?
Oh, yes. I mean, food is your sustenance, and having good balanced meals, even till today, supper time is at 6 p.m., and my family all know that. And whether they're home and at the table or calling on the phone because they know Mom will be home at 6 o'clock, that whole food process is ingrained. Speaking in terms of food itself, we always ate quite good meals: meat, potatoes, a vegetable, oftentimes dessert. We lived with my grandmother, my father's mother, Rachel Madison Harding, until I was 12 years old, and she made the most wonderful lemon meringue pie, raisin pie, bread pudding with raisins. There's a whole list of things. Also, because my older brother, Morris, had sickle cell anemia, we often had liver with bacon and onions. That was a way to mask the taste of the liver, I think. And my dad, being a businessman, we were reasonably well off when I think in today's standards of how we lived, and food was always very important. We went down to the market on Saturdays to buy fresh vegetables, and they had the meat market there as well, and the Jewish confectionery where you'd get authentic cheesecake and things like that. And also my dad had a lot of clients of different backgrounds, and so we had the opportunity to taste different cultures' foods from a very early age. Spaghetti from Joe's, Chinese food from Ing's. So there was never a lack of variety.
Your options were pretty broad there.
Very, very broad. And my mom, there were 6 kids in the family, and my mother would cook a different meal for each child, as long as we ate it. That was the caveat. Don't waste food.
That is quite an endeavor, time and resource management-wise, to do
Right.
6 different meals.
Well, I guess you could say we were spoiled. And I don't have any problem with that. One of my favorite things was the pancakes that my mother made. And the reason they were my favorite, she would make a Mickey Mouse face, and she'd start out with a little dot for the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Then she'd do the ears, and then pour the rest of the batter in for the face. And so they were different colors. It was actually a face. Just things like that. Great tall, 6-inch high angel food cake she made from scratch. And one of our favorite family stories, as a black family, there were some recipes that we had that other cultures might not. And my father liked chitlins, which are pig bow, and my mother hated them. And he asked her to make some one time, and she put on her rubber gloves to even touch them. And he had just purchased a new pressure cooker for her. She put them on, and they were cooking away, and all of a sudden we heard this huge bang. Pressure cooker had exploded. The whistle thing on the top was embedded in the ceiling. It had knocked off the screen door on the kitchen, and there were chitlins hanging from the ceiling. Dad never asked her to cook them again. But she did get a new pressure cooker.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know that chitlins can be polarizing on the best of days, and I don't think an incident like that would really improve your opinion of them.
Oh, dear.
You mentioned, going to the market with your family. Just wondering at that time, like say when you'd go to the market, would there be like at the market or kind of in that area, different like cultures and like vendors available?
Oh, yes. Windsor's always been a very multicultural area, and specifically there were black vendors. Where I live now in Essex County, in the rural area, in the Harrow-Colchester area, there had been black people living since the late 1700s. And specifically, the Johnson family and the Mulder family had what you would call truck crops, garden crops, potatoes, corn, peas, carrots, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Even some of the Mulder family grew peanuts, and we're way north for growing peanuts, but they successfully did. All of those things were absolutely available. Many different cultures. Another funny story, I remember one time my mother was looking at cow brains.
All right. Yep.
And asking the vendor, how you cook them and everything. And I'm tugging at her skirt. Mommy, don't buy that. Don't buy that.
Did she?
And she didn't.
Okay.
But my mother was interested in talking to different people and knowing how they made their things. Her very favorite food, I believe, was Hong Su pickerel.
Okay.
Which is a Chinese dish, and the whole fish is on the plate. And whenever Mom and Dad had any sort of a bit of a disagreement, she was sure to get Hong Su pickerel that evening. So, oh dear. Very seldom eat leftovers for the meal the next night. They might have it for lunch the next day or whatever they choose to do with it. But I try to have a different meal every night. You're never going to find the same meal on the table twice in a row here, or for that matter, twice in a week. We're still quite diverse in our eating habit. And 3 meals a day. When I was a little girl, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks. I made my first apple pie with my grandmother when I was 3 years old. I had my own cake pan.
Oh.
I had my own ironing board and plug-in iron. when I was 3 years old.
That is a very cute mental image.
Yeah. And, we had a pantry adjacent to the kitchen, and the refrigerator was in there as well, and we had an ice box out on the back porch, and the iceman would deliver the ice and so on and so forth. So yeah, food was very integral.
Yes. And it sounds like if this makes sense, like a very active part of your family.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was not just a staple, it was a part of our existence. I cannot remember not being interested in cooking. Of course, I was a curious child on many levels, but seriously, I am actually a professional cake decorator.
Oh my.
When I got married, the request for my cake from a bakery was lost. And so the day of my wedding, my step-grandmother from New Jersey had brought a black bride and groom, the first black bride and groom cake topper in the city. And she and another lady that I called Grandma, old generational family friend, bought 2 slab cakes and put it together and made a cake. And I was very appreciative of what they had done, but I was very disappointed. And so I went and took cake decorating lessons. I can do all that kind of stuff, and, the sugar, the candies, and all that business, because I didn't want anybody else to be disappointed that way.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother made my older sister's wedding cake, the rum cake. My sister got married in September, so I think Mom started it in March. You'd bake the cake with the fruit and all that business in it, and then pour rum on it and store it for several months until that was all absorbed into the cake, Then buttercream icing and all the decorations and things. So, yeah, everything was about food, I guess, when you get right down to it.
This is a bit of a tangential question, but I was just wondering, was kind of food preparation, was your father much involved with that or like cooking and things, or was that kind of more so either your mother or say just the women of the family?
Everyday cooking, but my dad was a barbecuer of renown. When he built my mother the home, he built a barbecue pit out of the same brick. Today they'd call it a pizza oven, but it was, the side oven on it, and you could bake your bread or roasts or things in there, and then the barbecue. And of course that brings us to the barbecue sauce from the Emancipation celebration.
Right.
He had that recipe from his friend Luke Morgan, who had run the pit for the barbecue for years. And I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, kids in the family were after me for different family recipes, and that was one of the ones that I included in a little pamphlet for a Christmas present to all of my siblings' children and my own children and grandchildren.
I bet people were pretty excited for that one.
Yes, they were. Now, the only difference my father made was to put beer in the recipe. Making
Nice.
it our own.
Yes. And I'm sure everyone, as they go on, they'll kind of all put their own little spin or twist on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But we started out with the original. I'm not going to give you all the particulars, but one of the things that gave it a better flavor was to leave the leaves on the celery.
Okay.
At the pits, they would chop up the whole celery, but in home cooking, using the leaves, it gave it a stronger, better taste.
I like that. That's the sort of thing you can tell that you've done trial and error and tweaking, and maybe if I do this time.
Well, and it makes a difference. You know yourself, the quantities or the types of accompaniments you use in your food. Caribbean cooking is because they have particular spices where they come from. Here, sometimes we had to substitute, as with any culture from anywhere in the world, because you could only get what you could get. These days, it's more global, but not back then. Oranges were Christmas presents when I was a little girl.
Yes. So to just transition a little, because we're kind of edging around the topic, I'll get to Emancipation Day. For a little background, about how old would you have been when you started attending those celebrations?
As long as I can remember. I know there's one picture of me with my grandmother sitting in the grandstand when I was 3 years old. And I clearly remember that day. I certainly remember even before that time of year, it was special. It was kind of like coming up to Christmas, to be honest. You'd see family members at that time of year that you wouldn't see at Christmas because traveling in the wintertime is sometimes prohibitive in this area of the world.
Right.
But I had an uncle and his family that lived in Owen Sound, Ontario, and Uncle Bill and Aunt Frances and Terry and George would come down for emancipation. And he was my favorite uncle. He always brought me a jar full of coins. He was a bus driver and a stationary engineer. Well, in the bus driving part of it, they'd get a lot of leftover change. And every night he said he would empty his pockets and that he'd bring that to me at emancipation time. So obviously I'd look forward to that.
Of course.
And then he'd take me for ice cream and we'd sit and chat out on the porch. And I always liked talking to adults anyway, but my grandmother would anticipate his coming and make sure her bedroom was cleaned up and, of course, make sure my mother had the rest of the house cleaned up, which wasn't a problem, but Grandma just nagged her because that was her boy Willie coming. Remember one time, they didn't get in until, oh my gosh, it must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning. And he thought he was surprising everybody. He'd wake everybody up.
Yep.
He climbed in my grandmother's bedroom door.
Yep.
And we heard all this commotion. Her bedroom door was just off the front porch. She had picked up a shoe.
Oh.
And threw it at whoever was coming in the door,
right.
in the window, and it was Uncle Bill.
Mm-hmm.
But, he didn't wake the whole family up anyway. My mother was already up Emancipation weekend and definitely the day of the parade, the Sunday. She'd be up by 3 o'clock in the morning and start frying chicken and start preparing all the other dishes, you know. So it was really, really important and really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And of course we got new clothes to go to the emancipation, to go to the park.
Yep.
And I'm going to say 3 or 4 days prior, my dad would start wiring the park and, you know, the different venues would get put in place and the barbecue pit would get built in its specific area.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go along with Dad. I always got free rides, which was another bonus. And, you know, my brother, if he was well enough to go, same thing, but I'm just giving you my experience.
Right.
Riding on the merry-go-round, and I caught the brass ring, so I guess that's why my life's been so wonderful. But it was just a very exciting, inclusive time. All the community, and it didn't matter whether it was black or white, but specifically the black community, people would save their money to be able to buy new outfits or have the money to go on the rides or to buy the barbecue and chicken from the pit. And one of the Johnsons that I talked about that had a stall grew corn on the cob. And so the corn would be dipped in big vats of butter and, of course, the candy apples and the candy floss. And, I mean, it was just heaven. Plus the smell of the barbecue pit wafted for blocks. It set a delicious backdrop for that whole weekend.
It would have really kind of permeated everything, right?
Absolutely. Everything. You know, when your mom fixes your favorite meal and you can smell it.
Oh, yeah.
And even now, like my mom's been dead for 30 years, I can still smell the meals she made when I think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I can still smell the smell of the barbecue pit for the emancipation. You could not get that specific type of barbecue anywhere else or at any other time. So it was really special.
And I know another factor we had talked about, too, that contributed to that kind of uniqueness was that the supplies, like the food, it was grown and supplied in large part locally, right? Yes.
And speaking about locally grown food, if you've ever been down to the Essex County region, there's a specific taste to the food because soil that it's grown in. Our area has something of a more sandy type of soil, and the grape growing industry, actually started in this region over 100 years ago. And then it moved up to the Niagara region where it became more famous. But now, here in Essex County, in Colchester region, we've got 13 local wineries again. And if you go up to Kent County, the taste of the food, it's got a kind of an iron taste to it, more of a metallic taste. I can't, unless you taste it, unless you experience it. But that's world over. Different areas have things that taste different because of the soil they're grown in. So that's all included into the uniqueness of the taste of the foods from the Emancipation celebration, plus the fact that the pork was locally purchased. The animals that ate the vegetables and things from the area had that taste in them too.
Yeah, it makes you think about, I'm sure we've all experienced getting a recipe from someone for something you really like, got it exactly, you copied exactly, and somehow it's just not quite the same.
Right.
And it could be, like you said, you're not using meat that was grown in this particular region,
right,
or that was prepared in this particular way, and all those subtle things can kind of come together to not make it off, but it's not how you remember.
It's not the same.
Yes.
It's the same concept. If you have even a porch garden and you grow tomatoes,
mm-hmm.
they taste so much better than what you get in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not all full of chemicals, they're not stored before you get them. You pick something right off the vine or pull it right off the tree. It's got a more wholesome, earthy flavor to it. Hasn't been frozen or altered in any way.
Mm-hmm. So you'd mentioned that your mom was kept very busy preparing food for the celebrations. Your dad was assisting in setting up the actual venue itself. Were any other family members involved in the organization of the event, or did your parents have any kind of additional things they would do?
I know that Mom and Dad were very good friends of Walter Perry,
mm-hmm.
who was the initiator of the Emancipation
yep.
celebrations, or the modern-day Emancipation celebrations, because there were Emancipation celebrations in the right from 1834 on in this area. But the big one, the greatest freedom show on earth, as it was called, was Walt Perry's baby. And the Perrys would come to our home, and I'm sure that with any large-scale event, you're working on it all year. The day it ends, it starts for the next year. And yeah, I know that Dad was involved in some of the promotions and donations. The group that put on the Emancipation celebration, they were called a group of brothers: Walt Perry, Russell Smalls, Lou, my dad, J. Lyle Browning, people like that. They worked with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
These were not just locals who had a bit of luck with an event. This was an international process with an international network. There'd be busloads of people from all over the United States, as well as Japanese, Chinese, Germans, who specifically planned their holidays to be in Windsor, Ontario for the Emancipation celebration.
Mm-hmm.
It was extraordinary. The parade would last for 2 hours up Olette Avenue with bands from all over North America. And of course, the Miss Sepia pageant was a beauty pageant for Black young women.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first Black pageant of that sort on the North American continent. Girls came from California, New York, the southern states, and, of course, Canadian Black girls as well from Ontario and Montreal to be in that event. It preceded the Miss Black America by quite a few years.
Mm-hmm.
The sunrise service, you'd have people like Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, Clara Ward, Elder Morton, who was a City of Windsor minister but had churches in Atlanta and other places internationally. Their groups would sing. I mean, it really was the greatest freedom show on earth because it was the celebration for the abolition of slavery by Great Britain in 1833. It had huge renown and huge respect. And, I'd see my friends from school on their bikes around, but Mr. Perry tried very hard to hire the young black boys and girls who were trying to make money to go to school and things like that, because a lot of jobs were not available for young black people at that time. That's just the way society was.
Yeah. If you recall, what sort of jobs or responsibilities would he have them doing?
Well, they could work on the concessions. They worked in the booth selling tickets. They hawked corn and pop and helped to peel the potatoes and shuck the corn and prepare the meat for the pits and made sure they kept the charcoal supplied. And my dad had a young apprentice that helped, actually several, because my former husband also wired the Emancipation celebrations at one time. It was that sort of a thing. And the food vendors, a man by the name of Elwood Land supplied all of the chickens. He grew chickens and turkeys, and a lot of us bought them when they were being killed off to put in our freezers. It uplifted the black community. It was a concerted effort to improve our economic status by dealing within the black community. But it also uplifted the entire community because people would come and stay in the hotels and motels and eat at the different restaurants and buy furs at Lazar's Furs on Olette Avenue. It was big time.
In our last conversation, too, you were telling me that also attracted non-black and specifically white vendors who recognized the economic potential of giving business to help support Emancipation Day.
Absolutely. The pork vendors were white.
Very
the
significant
hoteliers,
economic
of course,
opportunity for the black
taxi
community
drivers.
in Windsor.
It touched every facet of the community, plain and simple. And everybody benefited, whether they were actually the close network or not. People from the mayor right down to, say, the shoe cobbler would put ads in the Progress booklet, which was put out every year. And you can get a real good look at society at that time by looking at those booklets, because they spanned a 30-year area. It's fascinating when you look at things like you are, just from your particular vantage point, dealing with the food. For me, it was all-encompassing historical, and having been a part of it in the fact that I was a little girl that grew up with it, it was amazing what was accomplished. Absolutely amazing. And you think of things like Diana Ross and the Supremes got their contract with Motown in Windsor at the Emancipation celebrations.
Yeah, it seems like food and music were two kind of very integral pieces that I guess music itself would have also literally been the background of the celebrations or the foreground.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There were several young youth groups, singers and instrumentalists who went on to do reasonably well later on in their lives, and it was just magic. There were artists, you can look up by the name of Carl Owens, was just a teenager back in the 1950s, and he was allowed to set up a little area to do sketches. And he would come up to people as they were walking into the park and ask if he could do a sketch. Might have cost 50 cents, but he became a very, very famous artist. He was a sculptor. You can look her up. She started out with some of her stuff at the Emancipation celebrations. We knew in the black side of the community, if you had any sort of talent at all, you could get an opportunity to showcase it. And that is what happened. It wasn't strictly a black event, however. It was a multicultural event with black showcased highlights.
Yes.
That's how I like to see it. With the marching bands, they were black and white. Members of the Black Panthers marched in our parades a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
We got to meet people from pretty well any culture you can think of. The Windsor-Essex County area, when I was still at the museum, and we'll just say 20 years ago for ease sake, Windsor had close to 200 different cultures represented in Essex County at that time.
Wow.
Windsor was a mecca because of the auto industry.
Right.
People came here specifically to get hired into the auto industry, and it was booming. And so after the Second World War particularly, gosh, you got people from all over Europe, and all those people came to the Emancipation celebration. And we had friends across culture. We were a small society within society, but we were connected to everyone. You know, like I told you, my father had customers of pretty well every background you can think of. Plus the fact that at that time, when he started his business in 1947, sometimes white businessmen didn't want to do work for black people or for Chinese people or for Jewish people or for German people who came, you know, because they had lost the war, blah, blah, blah. And so he had a very good clientele. When I got married, there were 1,000 people at my wedding.
Oh, boy.
And I remember the very first person, when my husband and I came out of the church, at the top of the stairs, a gentleman who had recently done the cement work, because Dad had a garage built specifically for the reception, and his name was Mr. Coco. He handed my husband and I $500. And, you know, this is just personal history. Now, Coco are some of the biggest pavers in Canada. Emancipation prompted some of that because of the spin-off things that would happen.
Yeah. Well, you're establishing the partnerships with other communities just to get the celebration done, but like those relationships aren't over just because the parade ends.
No, they're long-lasting. Long-lasting. They're generational. And in the Black community, now there have been 2 different documentaries done on the Emancipation, The Greatest Freedom Show on Earth, and tomorrow night at the Capitol Theater here in Windsor, they're going to be previewing the story of Walter Perry.
Yes.
And it has won awards all over the world. I think it's gotten about 13 awards so far. None in Canada because Toronto Film Festival, Ottawa, and BC didn't choose to take it, but they will.
And I think that one is called Mr. Emancipation, is that?
Yes.
Okay,
it
yes.
is.
Yes.
That's correct.
Well, fitting for those documentaries to find kind of an international audience because, I mean, Emancipation Day, it really was like at every level, the local, the provincial, but then countrywide, and then, as we've discussed, literally worldwide.
Global.
Yes,
yeah.
Global. All of those connections existed.
Yeah, it really was. And you think at the time that event was happening from the 1930s until the 1960s, and think of all of the segregation movements, all the civil rights movements, all of the apartheid movements that were going on in the world, and there was that event happening in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
While, of course, it sounds like Emancipation Day was just in itself a great time, it was also like a political forum as well.
Absolutely. They were involved just locally. When the mayor is supporting something, that's municipal support. That's political. He would garner vote by supporting the Black community, right? And the Black community in Windsor was quite stable, quite well off. A lot of them were working in the factory. There were private business owners. There were men who worked for the city in different areas. They owned their own homes. We children were being better educated and better fed and were involved in the politics of the day. One of the people that came out of our area was Howard McCurdy.
Yes.
This was normal stuff for us. And going further politically, I say we, just speaking because I was a part of it in my family, helped to support the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King came to the Emancipation celebrations twice, once in 1953 and once in 1956 or 57, if I remember correctly. And he wrote back to Mr. Perry a letter when he declined to come in 68, I believe it was, 67, when Mr. Perry, just shortly before Mr. Perry died, because he was working on his own business and was shortly dead himself.
Yes.
So it's all an integral movement. When you look at it, it's so intertwined in society itself. It's unbelievable. You see it popping up in the strangest places, or the names of people who were involved in it popping up in the strangest places, because they were shakers and movers. They were involved in all kinds of stuff. And just the same as with the Harlem Renaissance, or speaking of First and Second World War, when black men came back home, they improved their lot. They didn't stay static. They were not, Windsor area, black people were not less than. Yes, there were some differences, but they were not less than. And we spoke up, and we fought for our own freedoms and civic rights and things of that nature, and had groups who involved in all that kind of stuff, and had sit-ins back in the 40s and so on and so forth. And these were all known players to each other. Walt Perry was one of them, and they all worked as a very harmonious group, which is something else that people should know.
So everyone kind of comes together to execute this collective vision.
Yes, and there was a group of women called the Our Day Study Club, and every year for the Emancipation celebrations, they would put on a special dinner, generally roast beef, mashed potatoes, a salad, and some seasonal vegetable at the Norton Prince Edward Hotel, which actually was a segregated hotel, but they allowed that dinner there because they made big money. And that's where they entertained Martin Luther King and Mary McLeod Bethune and all of those individuals. So there was a female component to it, too. It wasn't just men doing this, it was women. And I also make sure to tell people that. And they were wholly involved in the food. That was a part of it.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think of the way that on its face you might think, like food and politics or food and civil rights, two unrelated things, but not really in this context. They come together.
No, and when you think about it, when you hear about great things happening, they sit down and break bread together. So it isn't so different, is it?
No. I think, to quote a previous conversation that we had, I believe you said that the food it fueled those political conversations.
Yes,
and movements.
Absolutely. When you can have something delicious to eat, it makes you more comfortable, so it makes you more open. And that was a part of what the Emancipation celebrations were about, too. Please come see what the black community has come to since emancipation.
Yes.
And I mean, you'd see these people from all walks of life, but of course for me, it was particularly black people, because I was always zoned in on that, even as a small, small child. Beautifully dressed, beautifully coiffed, absolutely elegant in their movements and their elocution. And I mean, you couldn't help but want to be the best you could be. And of course, for the teenagers, you got a chance to see boys or girls from different places. Oh my God.
Yes. That sounds like its own whole other thing. That's a whole other story as well.
But that's also over food too. You're
Yes.
sitting at your picnic table, because there were picnic tables there, or sitting with your family on the ground with their picnic basket or whatever, from all over North America.
Mm-hmm.
And many, many, many Canadian women, particularly, married into American families.
Yes.
And that was one event in 1955. They closed the border because so many people were coming to the emancipation celebrations,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have proper documentation. So I can remember some families were split up for almost 6 months before
Ooh.
they got proper documentation to be able to go back home and over into the States, because we didn't have a border.
Yeah.
We didn't get immigrant status when we came here as refugees after through the Underground Railroad and fleeing on our own. And in fact, Canadian blacks were not invited to become Canadians until 1911. So documentation per se hadn't been a part of our process. Just like with the Aboriginals, there was no border for us. And so that was one of the highlight things that stuck out to me. Why didn't Aunt so-and-so go home with the family? And what's all this business about, they can't go back until they get papers? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's something I have not encountered stories about. So you've very much piqued my curiosity there.
Yeah, because it's not a Toronto thing, it's a local thing. A lot of women from Buxton and Chatham and Dresden and Windsor and Harrow, just to name a few, married American men.
Yeah.
And of course they were going to be coming to the emancipation celebrations. Everybody came to the emancipation celebrations. Well, you come across the border and you ask somebody where they're going, and they say over to the emancipation celebrations, and then you're going on your way back, and they ask, are you bringing anything back? And, oh, well, I'm bringing my mom's so-and-so or whatever, and can I see your papers? And you're not American. When my oldest daughter married an American, she had to go to Toronto to get documentation so that he was able to vouch for her for a certain number of years to go to the States. You had to have your green card if you were working over there. Well, those things weren't a part of our process. Because they weren't really, really focused on. White people were doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But it affected everybody coming back across the border at that time.
Right.
And then the other politics, when you talk about, if you'll read in the Windsor Star back issues talking about a riot at the arena, it wasn't a riot. Every year they held a dance at the arena for kids, and some kid got cut with a knife, and that got blown out of proportion. This was in the early 60s. They were worried. It was just before the riots in Detroit when they burned stuff down.
Yep.
But the political climate was getting built up at that time.
Yes. I've seen a few kind of like documents from that time that, interestingly, they kind of, there's almost a little like, tension about particularly Black Americans traveling to Canada, and the idea of, Windsor's going to be kind of filled with all of these Americans, and
exactly. And the police department in the city of Windsor, up until most recently, and I think still, was the highest paid police departments in Canada because they had to deal with the Americans coming across the border. And I'm quietly trying to find out what happened during COVID, whether they could still substantiate that, and I know they couldn't.
Interesting. Huh. See, even now this started, we're still, we'll get back to the food later, but even we start with food and we end up, in places like these, and it's kind of interesting the path that you
Absolutely. It
end up
touched
going
everything.
down. Yes.
It just simply touched everything. And all that while, the smell of the barbecue pit wafted for blocks. Yeah. Absolutely blocks. I mean, when you keep a pit burning for 4 days and cooking food for 4 days, that is huge aroma.
Oh, I'm imagining it now, and
right. I can smell it. I can. It's a sensory remembrance that you can never forget if you've ever been involved with it. And friends of mine that, I tell them different things I'm involved in. And I was talking with one guy. He was a friend of my brother, known him for 65, 70 years. And when he first came to Windsor, when he first came to Canada in 1951, he came from Holland. And when he moved to Windsor and became a friend of my brother, and, you find out what people's parents are doing and whatnot. And, the black guys were going to the emancipation celebrations, so Hank came along, and, he has as vivid memories as I do.
And has he ever shared kind of his impressions of, like, the first couple times he went, or the first time he went, like, what struck him or really stood out to him at that time?
Yeah, he was blown away. He had never seen so many black people in his life. And not just that they were black people, they were well-heeled black people, and they could afford to go on the rides and buy the food, and he couldn't.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. When they came to Canada, they were taken to a little community called not Merlin, trying to remember here, just outside of Chatham, Blenheim.
Okay.
Blenheim.
Yep.
Cherry orchards and things like that. And that's, they would come to Canada, bring them here, and they'd work on farms and whatnot. And they lived in a barn. Well, his dad had been a tailor in Holland, and in fact hid Jews in their home. And so when they came to Canada, they were at the bottom of the list.
Yeah.
But he also said that some of the best friends he ever made, case in point, we're still friends, were black people. And he loved going to the emancipation celebrations. And I mean, like with the parade and the bands and the marchers, and that music filled up the whole city. 2 hours at a time. That's enormous. Huge amounts. And then there'd be a band tattoo at the fairgrounds. And, bands would win trophies and things, and the band from Buxton most often won. They were black. It was just, and it was not because they were choosing black, it was because they were good. And people got to see this right in front of their own eyes. This isn't some story, some myth. This really all took place.
Yes.
And people of all walks of life have those remembrances.
Yeah, and it brings together, like, it kind of gives you an opportunity outside of different communities that could otherwise be sometimes very literally, but quite segregated.
Correct.
That's kind of like a safe space for all those different groups to come together and kind of actually see and interact with each other in meaningful ways.
Exactly. And again, because of the auto industry, people came here from all over the world. And a lot of times when they first came to these communities. I can remember one gentleman who became quite a prominent engineer in this area and laid out some golf courses and things like that. His name was Louis Scadeller. He said the first person to feed him when he came to Windsor was a black family. And he would never forget that. And when I worked on getting the church, the Nazarene Church, restored at the museum, so many people, so many business people who offered their services told similar stories.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't a fact of, oh yeah, a lot of my friends are black. No, a lot of their friends really were.
Yes. And it very tangibly supported them. Yes. I'll just pivot us back a little more specifically to the foods. Just don't want to take up too much of your time there, though I'm like, let's keep going on all these
what you need, I hope.
Oh yes, no, this is fantastic. So we've been talking quite a bit about the foods of Emancipation Day. I guess I'd like to hear, what were your favorite foods that you could get during that time?
Through Emancipation or when I was little?
Emancipation Day.
Yeah, through Emancipation, of course. I honestly liked the chicken better than the ribs, just because they were easier to eat as a little girl.
Right.
You know, I'm going back to memories from, I will say 3 because that's definite, but I also always liked getting the corn on the cob because I would like to watch them dip it into the big thing of butter and bring it out and then put a handful of paper towels around it, and they'd get all saturated, and you could suck that and get the corn taste out of it too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
nice.
I would hear in the summertime, I buy the corn because it reminds me of that. It came from here, and I, of course, was always a candy apple girl. A lot of events, like the Harrow Fair. It's the longest running fair in this area. One of the only reasons I go, number one, it is to support the fair because it's our community. But I buy a candy apple.
Right.
They still taste the same, which is interesting enough because cane sugar and beet sugar are different commodities, and we used to grow a lot of sugar beets in this area over the years. But nonetheless, it's just that flavor that I've been lucky enough to be able to continue to taste Emancipation every year because it was locally grown food, in-season food, that was at that celebration. And then my grandmother made her potato salad, and that was her grandmother's recipe, which I still have, and I'll be making that on Sunday. And, you know, that's another thing. Without even deliberacy, this is Emancipation Weekend. So yes. I went to the store yesterday and I bought all the ingredients, and I wasn't thinking because it was Emancipation Weekend. I was thinking because this weekend, corn on the cob's still available and not overripe. I'll be making the potato salad, and I'm going to have ribs.
Yes. So, oh boy.
You know, it's so ingrained in your soul that you don't even think about it. It's just kind of an automatic thing.
And it's like those foods were like, it's just the right food for just the right time of year, you know?
That's correct.
The middle of the summer.
That's right.
Yeah.
Readily available, grown by Black people, and cooked and served by Black people. How many Black people from the 1950s who've lived in different areas, particularly in Canada, can say that?
Yeah.
You
Not
might
too
have your
many.
own little select group, but I'm
Yes.
talking about thousands of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was
Um.
a sight to see. It was just phenomenal, and I know that it was phenomenal
Mm-hmm.
even as a small child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask, and if you don't think it applies, that's totally fair. Do you think that any of those memories of, say, like those, treats and sweets, did that influence at all your decision later of the going into the cake decorating and the confectionaries and stuff like that?
Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I would watch my mother and my grandmother do their particular baking. Like I said, my grandmother was pies and puddings and those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
My mother made the angel food cakes, and um, she wasn't professional in her decorating style, but she was good.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that they both used to do was starch um, doilies with sugar,
Okay.
and then you could mold them and make them have ripples or twists and beautiful different things in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily, well, it's not an edible, but it's a food source.
Yes.
So yeah, I have you ever seen those sugar eggs with the seams inside of them?
Yes, yeah, I have. Mm-hmm.
I do that,
Ooh,
and I did it very well. And I
very
make
fancy.
uh, roses and different other flowers that almost look real.
Mm-hmm.
I just, my hand-eye dexterity and my soul are just into that kind of stuff. My grandson's getting married in October,
Mm-hmm.
and a friend and I are going to be doing his shower cake. They're having a Jack and Jill in August,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm going to be doing their wedding cake in
Oh.
October. And these days, one of the things is using paint palettes
Mm-hmm.
to decorate cakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so my girlfriend and I were practicing that just a couple of days ago.
Mm.
So yeah, it's kind of learning from the knee of my elders,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also wanting to take it to a level of excellence that wasn't just homegrown.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've got the certification to do this type of
Yes.
thing, and I'm the kind of a person, and always was. If I was interested in something, I wanted to try it or accomplish it. If you understand.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You set your
So
mind to it, and there you
yeah,
go.
yeah. I made cakes that cost quite a few dollars, and
Mm-hmm.
when my oldest daughter was married, her cake was 5 feet high with a
Oh boy.
fountain in it. And
Oh boy.
yeah, my sister-in-law had over 300
Mm-hmm.
handmade flowers, roses, yellow and uh, soft butter yellow,
Mm-hmm.
all trailing down. You'd turn the cake and there'd be decorating all the way around it. But
Yes.
I made all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds
I
gorgeous.
love it. Just,
Yeah.
just absolutely love it.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I was thinking to myself at the beginning of this, oh, good thing I had dinner already, but I'm I'm hungry again. So
Yeah, it does. Makes you hungry.
yeah, I'll have to get a late night snack before bed.
Yeah, I'll be definitely doing that.
Yeah.
I just have some lemon pound cake that I'll have with a
Oh,
cup of tea later.
yes.
Because I still make little things like that. But when I broke my wrists a couple of times, so
Mm-hmm.
it's not as easy. But I love it, and I'll pay the price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's worth it.
Yeah, I'll pay the price. I remember one little girl's cake. Not a little girl. She was my girl. My daughter's girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
When she got married, her grandmother had made cakes for the family and had recently passed away. And one of the things was swans that went on the cake. And so I did it for her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you show me a picture, I can do it. And it's just a loving thing.
Yes, I've been thinking about how, food preparation can in itself be an act of love. And I mean,
absolutely.
if we extrapolate.
That is what the barbecue pit was all about, too.
I was going to say, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's a very nice thought.
A love note to the community, without a doubt.
Yeah. This is not going to help either of us be less hungry. But I wanted to specifically, I guess we've talked about it, but specifically just bring attention to the barbecue pits themselves, because that's a feature of the Food of Emancipation Day that keeps coming up again and again.
Right.
Different people's experiences or stories or whatnot. Do you want to talk about that to any extent?
Well, if you want to talk about the construction of them,
mm-hmm.
I mean, to a little kid, they were immense. And even as a grown woman, because my former husband was helping to wire the park from 1961 to 1965,
mm-hmm.
66, when it was waning. But as a small girl, the emancipation pits were built from cinder blocks,
mm-hmm.
which were easy to put up and easy to take down, and would hold the heat.
Mm-hmm.
And they were generally, I'm going to say, 4 blocks high, because a cinder block is about 8 inches, so 4
right.
blocks high, maybe 5 blocks high. So they didn't have to bend over
right.
too much,
mm-hmm.
but it wasn't so high that they had to reach.
Mm-hmm.
And they were probably, I'm going to say, 3 feet across. There was some kind of metal rod into the center of the cement to keep stability. And they were wired together so that they made the top, the rack.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yep.
And that was what the metal was. So they would oil it, and when the food was on it, they'd keep throwing water on it, because
mm-hmm.
you can imagine it was a huge amount of heat coming out of the coals.
Yes.
When they're that, because you had to get them up high enough that the heat would reach the food properly and fill up that pit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the structure of what it was. And then, keep in mind, even with oiling the rods, the mesh on top,
mm-hmm.
so that food wasn't falling through it. Little bits and particles when you're barbecuing get stuck to the rods.
Yeah, the grill itself.
And so the smell just built.
Mm-hmm.
The smell of cooked meat just built. And it was absolutely delicious,
mm-hmm.
Mixed with it was a mild charcoal smell. It wasn't heavy charcoal smell, and it wasn't like they lit it with gasoline or anything like
mm-hmm.
that. They were very particular about how they started the fires, with the kindling and paper and stuff, and then got it going. So they had to start doing that maybe a day before the actual event started.
Right, just to build the fires up?
Even when you do a barbecue, you turn it on to get it warm before you start cooking at home.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a real job.
Yeah.
And like I say, the younger boys particularly would be working with that kind of stuff. They'd bring in truckloads of wood and truckloads of charcoal and help get the pit built and everything, because all that had to come out after the events were over. It wasn't a constant feature at the park.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of hustle and bustle and a lot of preparation.
Yep.
And, young kids going there trying to get a job and trying to help out however they could to make the money, even if it was only to buy the meal
mm-hmm.
or to get a piece of chicken or a rib on the side while people were cooking. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
All of that was going on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there were those who were being taught how to be pit masters, because the men and women who worked those pits were pit masters.
Mm-hmm.
They could have started a restaurant anywhere had they been able to do so.
And that's another good thing, thank you for mentioning. So there would be both men and women tending the barbecues themselves.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I remember one couple that I know actually met that way.
That's quite a love story.
There were many love stories, but they're both passed away now, but they were maybe 10 years older than me, largely George and Rosie Thomas. And she helped with getting the meat prepared. George started out as a kid selling pop at the Emancipations and then graduated to helping out at the pit, and the rest is history.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And there were just all kinds of outgrowths in terms of stories. Kids who made their money to go to school every year, post-secondary education I'm talking about. So it uplifted our community. It gave an upwardly spiral movement to the community, and people, made contacts that put them in better places.
Yeah. So
every year, from the proceeds of the Emancipation celebrations, we would take our family vacation 2 weeks, just the first of September. Dad would save the money from the Emancipation celebrations. I got my first bank account counting the money. He told me, he brought home 2 bags of money, and he told me if I could count it correctly, I was 6 years old, I'd get 10%. I absolutely counted it correctly.
Very carefully.
My first bank account.
Yep.
You learned about the dollar.
Yep. Yeah, but that's a good way to start to teach you, like the financial skills that you need going through life at a very early age.
That's correct. And, it was a community of better, people had more knowledge of different things. Because they knew that through opportunity, you could get more out of life. All up and down that McDougall corridor that you've heard about, we owned our homes, actually owned them. We weren't renting, they were homeowners. Right. And some of them, through the years, paid them off and owned them completely. And in the summertime, you'd see them out, men and women, sweeping the sidewalks, putting in the flowers, keeping the yards neat, and cutting the grass and things. And in the wintertime, shoveling the sidewalks and spreading salt or sand. And we all had standards. It was a very, very good place to grow up. And now the rest of the world seems to be coming to our area to find out about what went on, because it was extraordinary.
Yeah. The really gratifying thing kind of about, learning about this history myself, but then when I get to tell people about it, they're so excited,
Yes, it is exciting. Black people as a whole, the history here has been overlooked or subverted. Everybody looks to the United States as where black culture comes from. Well, it doesn't. We've been here for very early times, steadily here since the late 1700s. And because of that, when you live in a region steadily, generationally, are more stable.
Mm-hmm.
And because you are stable, you can involve yourself in more things. And that's what these celebrations were about, too. We were passing information along to each other.
Mm-hmm.
We were showing each other that if you group yourselves together, you will do better.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what we did.
Yeah.
And we helped with the Underground Railroad movement through the early emancipation celebrations. This is an ongoing thing.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't a new idea, even when Walter Perry, he revitalized,
mm-hmm.
along with, like Walt was born in Buxton.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buxton group, somebody's going to study them more carefully as years go on,
Mm-hmm.
And their whole Labor Day celebrations and things. But Southwestern Ontario Blacks are a very old and stable society.
Mm-hmm.
And that also gives you the opportunity to think bigger, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. Yeah, when you're not just
subsisting.
Trying to just survive the day to day, you can.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Very, very few of us have been trying just to survive day to day for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
I've told you my family's been here since 1798 in Canada, Queensbush area, Sandwich Town area, Windsor area, Buxton,
Mm-hmm.
Owen Sound, Montreal. This gives you a different outlook on life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It makes you a bit more fearless.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that, because you can be. A lot of these people came on their own.
Mm-hmm.
These are Black people who got up and walked away from a horrible existence
Mm-hmm.
to become human beings. And also were able to celebrate freely.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something everybody's been able to do.
Yes. And
share what we have, what we own, what we like with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
The emancipation celebrations were open to everybody. Come if you like. Have a look. Get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Take a taste.
Yep.
Find out about the culture.
Yeah. It was all available for people to experience if they wanted to.
And we had the stability and maybe the audacity
mm-hmm.
to get out there and show what we got.
Yeah.
You should have seen people. The sidewalks were 8 or 9 deep
mm-hmm.
during the parades. Kids on their bikes, people in their cars,
mm-hmm.
Families coming together just to watch those extravaganzas.
Mm-hmm.
I remember some of the high-stepping leads of the bands and all of the dances the bands would do, twirling around with
mm-hmm.
their drums and backing up, and it was a show and a half. I mean, it was just fabulous in their costumes, and then of course the talent contest and Blacks and whites involved themselves in that too.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just for Blacks, but you really, really saw the best of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the church groups, gospel is famous the world over.
Yep.
Well, you got the best gospel shows
mm-hmm.
at emancipation celebrations. There's never been anything like it since.
Yeah. No, it's a peculiar set of circumstances coming together to create a very special event.
Right. Actually, a fortunate set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
The best of the best at the best time.
Mm-hmm. And the right time, yes.
Yeah. The 50s and 60s particularly were really energizing times. Blacks as a whole were coming into their own. But that Emancipation Celebration event showed Black people, as well as other cultures, what you could do and who we were. People would go away from there shaking their heads. You'd hear comments, "Oh my God, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Oh my God, that was just the most wonderful experience I've ever had." And they meant it. And I mean it, because it was.
Yes.
And I've been, to the expo and different events and events in the United States. There's never been anything like it. Because it wasn't a fair. It wasn't an agricultural event. It was the Emancipation celebrations. This has just encompassed everything. In a beautiful setting. Jackson Park at the time that I remember the Emancipation celebrations, there was a Black man who worked for the city of Windsor. His name was Billy Bush, and he did all of the horticultural maintenance. Beautiful rose garden. It was famous.
Okay.
Also, the sunken gardens. Mr. Bush was right at the top of his game. And that was all part of the Emancipation celebrations. Yes. It wasn't just a field. It was a beautiful place.
Yes. Yeah. So it was really just like the setting that was created, the atmosphere.
Yes.
Like you said, it was just excellence in
Everything
so many.
Was excellent.
Yes.
Yeah. It was all excellent. And, family reunions, even if it wasn't your family, it was a yearly event where you'd grow up and see people. I honestly do remember seeing my former husband when I was a kid during those celebrations.
Right.
But, it's years after when you think about things in retrospect. Because I had known him from the time I was 5 years old, and he was 9. Very good friends of his mother, very good friends of my mother were his mother's family. So it's all that kind of intermingling as well.
Yes.
And then my dad hired him to be an apprentice, and we got married, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty well anybody you ever spoke to about emancipation will have stories like that to tell you.
Yeah. We have hit all of my points very thoroughly.
Good.
I'll just kind of say I'll throw out a final just thing of like, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about or talk about that I haven't asked you already, but you want to share?
Well, I think there just should be a little footnote that, and I think you'll agree, studying whatever facet you're working on about the Emancipation celebrations is very rewarding.
Definitely.
And if people took a look at how those celebrations brought the world together in a joyous place, we would have a better world overall. And I'm serious about that.
Yeah. You can find us on our social media channels at Jackson Park Project, except for Twitter, that will be at Jackson P Project. You can also send us an email at jacksonparkproject@gmail.com.